Well, thanks everybody for joining our latest chapter in HITRUST Secrets. Um, Good to see some new faces on the call today. Welcome, Aaron and Rodney. I think we've got everybody else has been kind of a repeat customer here. So as we kick off, does anybody have any specific questions that they want to bring up? I've got a couple of little rants that I wanted to go on, but
Ooh, that sounds like fun.
all right. Well, I'll get started on mine. I'm Sue Richards, one of the hosts of HITRUST Secrets every week. And so I was just at a HIMSS conference, and HIMSS is Health Information and Management Systems Society. So not necessarily security focused, but all healthcare IT. And I was here in Nashville. Great sessions. It's a little bit different than the most of the cybersecurity conferences that I go to, and it's definitely there was a session on cybersecurity and cyber resilience, and that's kind of what I want to rant about because it's for the most part the rest of the conference is very much IT, healthcare IT specific AI. There's chief medical officers there, so it's really interesting to get a different perspective on things. But they had a panelist discussion. So there's four different people. One was a lawyer, and she was actually leading kind of the moderating the panel. And the rest were all hospital IT CISOs. And so talked about how one of the guys made a statement about, well, information security isn't compliance, and compliance isn't information security. And so, I get that, I understand that, but then they were starting to talk about the HIPAA Security Rule and the new requirements that are coming out that, the entire supply chain and how you have to verify with each of your partners and then who they do business with and all that there's security controls in place. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, so you're a hospital, a covered entity. Are you telling your patients, or as they were talking about them today, consumers, just trust us. We've got all these in place. I don't want to have to go through this compliance thing. But yet, are you going to turn around then and tell all your vendors, oh, yeah, I just trust you? Or are you going to want some kind of assurance? And so it was just to me that ironic. I really wanted to stand up and go, well, hold on a minute. For those of us that are business associates, we've got to prove it. But you don't like really that whole compliance thing. So open it
You
up
should, you
for
should, you should
comments.
have stood up. Should have stood up and been like, "Hey, now, this isn't making much sense."
Yeah, I mean, I can see that the sphere of compliance goes beyond information security, and
Right.
having compliance doesn't necessarily mean you have information security, but the security controls, I have I have actually been asked by colleagues, "Don't you trust me?" And I was like, "Well, right, so this isn't
But
a
I
religious
verify.
institution.
Exactly.
This is
Exactly. Yeah.
verify. I need to
Right.
validate what's happening. That's part of the process to ensure that not only we know, kind of in our hearts, if we're going to be soft about it, that we're doing the security, but we can prove it to the people who need it,
Mhm.
whether they are our customers or part of our supply chain, or we're part of their supply chain. We have to demonstrate this with tangible information. That nobody should be taking it is trust and verify. Nobody should be taking
Exactly.
anybody's word for it.
Exactly. I mean, and I know it's not the first question that a patient or somebody coming in, especially to a hospital, you're not going to go, hey, how secure is my data? You're going to be like, fix, fix what's wrong with me, fix my broken elbow or whatever. But at the same time, I was just like, well, how is it that you're like, well, I don't really like that, and it's not to say that, I mean, the rest of the panelist discussion was really good. They were recognizing, information security risk is an operational risk, an enterprise risk, and kind of elevating, to that,
Yeah.
recognizing that, oh, well, we've asked for so long for a seat at the table as a CISO, and now we're there. And oh, yeah, now we're there, so how do we adapt into, stopping to the tech talk and really, understanding business.
Mhm.
And so one of the panelists had talked about that, and he said, it's more incumbent on us to, instead of teaching people about security, for us to be learning more about the business and,
Mhm.
the clinical decisions that go into things and how things operate so that we can take our perspective from a security, information security
Right.
perspective, but not just
Yeah.
go, well, we have all the answers, and so you just have to do it our way, so
Right.
there was huge kudos to that, but it was just that one part that I was like, well, wait a minute. I want to trust the whole way down, and even from the very beginning, the intake, that my information is secure.
Yeah.
Well, if you ask me, that sounds more like, hey, just don't ask me. I'm not going to be responding to you anyway, which is the healthcare's position on it. Uh, because I'll tell you from firsthand experience with a large health group here in Middle Tennessee, where I had an issue with them, and they did not meet their requirements. And so when I said, you need to provide me evidence that you're actually meeting the requirements, because you didn't meet even your basic HIPAA requirements when I requested information. And their response was their lawyer will contacted me and says, we don't have a requirement to do that. It's like, no, actually, you do have a
It's like, yeah,
requirement to do that.
remember this form you had me fill out at the very beginning that
Yeah.
nobody reads?
Um,
I read it.
well, one, I read it, and two, under the uh, Consumer Protection Act, when you tell me that you are being compliant, but you are not actually compliant, is what the FTC has qualified as fraudulent.
Mm,
And it is a fraudulent activity, and you are committing
Hmm.
fraud. Uh, and so the under the new guidance that are coming out, and also in addition to that, with the Consumer Privacy Act, which is currently under review, which will come out later this year, along with that, uh, it's going to make a significant change in what the healthcare industry is required to do and
mm,
what they can actually be held accountable for.
Mm.
Uh, and if anybody has any idea that, healthcare is doing what they are expected to do, the reviews and the surveys and the audits that have been done, uh, speak for
don't,
themselves to
yeah,
begin
they
with.
don't prove that out. Exactly.
Oh
But the
dear.
fact that in the last 2 years, 35% of healthcare CISOs have left healthcare. There's a
Oh,
reason for that, because they do not want to be held accountable when the healthcare organization falters.
well, and
Right.
it's interesting about that because they did bring up the fact that, that was the lawyer that was moderating that had kind of brought that up. And
Well,
she
the
said,
fact that you were talking to a lawyer just, negates the whole thing to begin with.
well, she was making a good point then because she said, it used to be that when you were a victim of ransomware, you were the victim. And now present day, you look at Change Healthcare where they had congressional hearings about it, and then, Ascension where all these CISOs are getting into trouble because of that. And it was kind of struck me as I thought about that. And I said, but I don't think it's the crime. I think it's the cover up, or to your point, the attestation. I'm doing this, and then
Well,
come to find out you're not. And that's where compliance comes into that, where you think you're
Hmm.
doing it, but you're not effectively doing it.
first
Right.
of all, compliance is simply it's a uh, it's meeting minimal standards.
Right.
And where does minimal fall within the range, A through F? Well, minimal is
Mm.
about a D. Um, so first of all, so I mean, if your requirement and all you're looking for is to just hit that requirement, you're not even coming close. But um, yes, under HIPAA, if there's a breach, the patient is not a participant in that. So there
Right.
is nothing that the patient can do. And if you look at every breach that's occurred, uh, that has had a class action suit filed against it, you have to read those suits very, very closely, because the what ultimately was the healthcare organization guilty of that caused damage,
Mm.
and it had nothing to do with HIPAA. It has solely to do with the fact that they allowed their data to be released into the wild in violation of the agreement that they had between the patient and themselves. Had nothing to do with HIPAA in these lawsuits. So the damage, the patient isn't a part of the whole HIPAA thing. So the idea of even considering that patient privacy is actually a factor in HIPAA isn't even true because the patient is not a member of the HIPAA triad.
But
So
I mean, all the rules are about patient privacy
right,
and
but
and
it
who
has
you can
nothing to
release it to
do
and all that.
right, but it actually has nothing to do with the patient. If you release a patient's information, are you violating HIPAA
Without their
from
authorization.
the patient's perspective? No, you're not. The patient cannot sue you for violating HIPAA. The patient has no recourse for violation of HIPAA because the patient is not a member of the HIPAA requirement.
So then
I
who
actually did
would?
hear something on that. Yes. So,
That's where the
um,
FTC comes
yes.
into
And
play with the Consumer Protection Act
Okay.
because they
yes.
have
And that
violated the patient's
it's
right under the Consumer Protection Act,
Okay.
it's going to
not
follow the
under
footprints of what the financial industry put together, right?
exactly. It is exactly what the financial industry put together. And when you look at one of the requirements, one of the new requirements that's coming out includes actually, we talk about cyber resiliency, and in the healthcare industry, and this was, in my view, this came specifically out of Change Healthcare. The new change is going to be that, healthcare now has 72 hours to be able to recuperate patient data. They have to bring all that patient data back forward, within 72 hours. In the financial industry, if a bank is closed for more than 3 days, the FTC or the FDIC comes in, takes over the bank, and hands their customers off to other banks. It's the same 72-hour requirement. Everything that we have seen for years and years and years under federal regulation of banking is what is going into the federal regulation of healthcare. But what people aren't seeing is the fact that healthcare HIPAA is still going to be fall under HHS,
Hmm.
but that patient privacy, which is now going to be a part of that, and the patient's recourse is going to fall under the FTC and the Consumer Protection Act and the Consumer Privacy Act.
And
And
that's where
the
consumers will have the opportunity to take
Right.
action.
Now,
Office of Civil
there's
Rights.
a big well, Office of Civil Rights falls under HHS. Um, the the other part of that you have to consider is under HIPAA, there are restrictions on penalties.
Hmm.
There's caps. Under FTC, there's not. They look at how much you made in the last year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and they base your penalty on how much you made while violating that law.
This is going to be an interesting change
They could,
for a
Hmm.
lot
yeah,
of hospitals and healthcare
these hospitals are
organizations.
what they're going to say is, oh, HIPAA says I can do this, or I'm not required for that, or my penalty is going to be based upon this. Well, yeah, HIPAA says that, but believe me, if you read what the FTC says about healthcare
Hmm.
in their positioning in healthcare, and they write things extremely plain and simple, and they will tell you when they go after companies and they find companies. There was a company that 2 years ago that had this app, tracked healthcare, tracked all your, how many steps you did, all this kind of stuff. They had been collecting patient healthcare information. Now they weren't directly part of HIPAA because they weren't a healthcare provider, but they still fell under that guidance of healthcare data in a non-healthcare organization.
Mhm.
So it was still PHI.
Mhm.
Uh, and they were in their policies and what they were providing to people said, we're not going to sell this, we're not going to trade it, we're not going to give it, we're going to hold your data secure. But they
But
weren't.
was it like under the FDA? I mean, were they using this
No,
information to kind of give them guidance and
no. They
treatment
were
plans or anything? It was just
they
they're
were
just
just
holding the data.
what they were doing is they were saying, they had an app that said, oh, you did this many steps, you should be losing this many calories, or you're doing this and you're doing that. But we also want to get all this other healthcare information on you to help determine what it is that you should be doing, because our
So
app
they
is
were
so great.
providing some suggested treatment plans.
Yeah,
Because I
but
know
it
when I was in
wasn't.
the dental space, we worried about that. We had a mobile app that would help you schedule, and you could download your treatment plans that were created. And we were kind of wondering, is that going to fall under FDA as a medical device because it's an app? And we were able to kind of walk through, with our legal team and see, where it's like, no, it's information only. You're not actually, the treatment plan is going face to face with your dentist. And
Right.
this was just a supplement to kind of be able to pull that information or schedule your next appointments.
Yep. Now, in this particular case, what happened is these guys were caught actually selling the data.
Right.
Oh,
That's where I was thinking it would be
Where it
really
says that
valuable as marketing or something else.
and they said they weren't going to do it. So people got together, they filed a suit under the FTC against these guys. And the FTC found them guilty.
Mhm.
Now, what they did is they did two things. They said during the course of your business over the last 2 years, you made $7.25 million, whatever it was. That's your fine. And
They
you
took
are
everything.
not and you are not allowed to ever collect healthcare information again. See, the FTC couldn't just say you're closed, but they closed them.
They basically
Right,
closed the
yeah.
business though.
Yeah.
Ooh,
And
that's
that's
steep.
how the FTC works. When you look at, in last year or in 23, HHS or OCR collected $2.5 million in fines.
Not much.
That much. Not much at all. I mean, it's next to nothing.
That feels like it's
Um,
gone down over the past several
it is.
years.
Almost every year it gets cut in half. It gets cut in half. As a matter of fact, at one point they had a healthcare organization that was guilty of a violation. Initially had agreed to a $2.5 million fine that they settled at $20,000. So it's
I'll
like,
take that.
why should I ever
Yeah.
do this?
20,000. That doesn't
Yeah.
even cover the cost of the investigation of the
No, it,
lawyers. I
it
mean,
doesn't.
I've met a few lawyers.
HHS doesn't
That's
care. When you look at
Doesn't
the
cover
I'm
lunch.
fines,
married to one. I know.
when,
I know
when you
how
look
it
at the
is.
fines that the FTC has implemented over the last 5 years, it's somewhere in the realm of $60 billion.
Mhm.
The FTC does not play around.
So
Right.
let me try to distill what I think you're telling us here, which I'm grateful for you chiming in because I don't think I appreciated what you're saying. But I want to try to bring it back around to where we started. It sounds like you're saying you're misinformed if you think patients as a consumer have named rights and standing under HIPAA.
Yeah, they do
It's
not.
really, it's the accountable party is the healthcare organization, and the party that they're accountable to is not the patient. It's
Right.
HHS and OCS,
It's
right?
OCR or OCR, right?
OCR, yeah.
Yes.
So, and what you're continuing to say is um, we should also factor in the risk imposed by what accountability we have to patients under Consumer
FTC.
FTC for
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
federal the
Right.
trade commission.
So,
But and so are those new FTC guidelines, or has this
Coming.
always been there and it's
No,
just
they
now
have
kind of
all
being
yeah, so Susan,
they've
this is kind of
always
where I wanted
been
to go
there.
next, which is
They have
like,
always been there, but as the uh as the new HIPAA rules are coming out this year, the enhanced HIPAA rules come out. It is following directly in line with the new rules that the FTC put out
Mhm.
for financial institutions because the FTC is taking over more control of the privacy and consumer role of this. And they're giving the people teeth as part of this. Uh, and when the new Consumer Protection Act or Consumer Privacy Act, which is going to fall in line very similar to GDPR, and God forbid we ever get to DORA in this country, uh, it's going to basically take it to that level where the patient will now have direct impact and can actually go after people and after financial institutions, not because they had a breach, but because they failed to meet requirements. Now, and they said they were meeting requirements, but they weren't. And now, if you go back and you look at that, and what does that really mean to companies? Um, you know, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, OCR did a study of, I think it was 103 hospitals. or not hospital, healthcare organizations. And they determined that 80% of medical organizations could not pass an OCR audit.
Now,
Nine,
I've got a question on the detail, the nuance here, and I don't know if this is where Aaron was going with his question, but is it that they couldn't prove they were doing it, or there was actual proof that they weren't doing it? Because those are different, right? I mean,
right.
if you've been in the middle of a high trust audit, the difference between being able to prove that you are doing it versus doing it are different things.
No. Well, this was done through questionnaire.
A
And
questionnaire.
through questionnaire, they were asking people these questions. Because if they actually went in and did audits, then they would have to do something about it. So
Yeah, fair enough.
this was done a little differently. But what the determination was is that uh, 90% of healthcare organizations and 80% of hospitals could not pass an audit.
Mm.
Okay. Now, when you look at what was done last year here in Middle Tennessee, when the state did an audit of over 100 hospitals, 93% of them failed in simply in
Mm.
simply providing meeting the Transparency Act piece of being able to provide you proper bill expectations,
Mhm.
providing you that costing up front.
That's
93
interesting.
hospitals in
Yeah,
Tennessee failed that.
that's kind of crazy. Now,
Just
I do
that
want to
simple.
circle back around to Aaron's question because I don't know if your question got answered or not. Aaron, do you want to jump
Yeah,
back in?
I mean the hyperbolic version of my question is why do I care, right? So
Well,
it's
because
Mhm.
what's going to happen is
wait, hang on, let
as
me finish.
okay,
Copper Mountain is what's your real name? Copper Mountain?
it's Rod.
Hey, Rod. Okay. I think I like Copper Mountain better, but
Yeah, me too.
but um, so are we talking about we need to be aware of situations where we might be meeting HIPAA expectations, but we are still exposed on FTC regulatory specifics,
Um,
or are we just saying the magnitude of impact is more severe than you might think under HIPAA regulations? So
well,
that's kind of
that's the
the
issue.
Venn diagram that I like to
Well,
distill out of this.
Mm.
if you can prove that you are actually meeting HIPAA requirements, then you're meeting the protected. If somebody was to then file suit against you under the FTC, uh, would they have standing? You know, probably not. But the
Mhm.
question is, if somebody was to file a suit, especially a class action suit against a healthcare provider that required discovery, would that discovery stand up to prove that you're actually meeting requirements? And I'll tell you, from every healthcare organization that I've ever done an audit for, the answer would be no.
Mm.
So it's almost philosophically almost like a criminal versus civil. So if OCR and HHS say yes, you're guilty, at that point it makes that FTC class action lawsuit easier, but
Mhm.
it not necessarily preclude, because even if OCR and HHS said no, you didn't violate HIPAA, you could still bring it. It would just probably be a higher burden of proof to say that, not knowing what the judgment would be.
Correct.
Yeah.
However,
Okay.
And
the issue,
I
here's the
think
issue.
when you're looking at things like a breach too, if
Yeah.
if you've suffered a breach and that's why you're in hot water in the first place, I feel like the organization that suffered the breach is going to be the one with the burden of proof
Well, I
because
mean,
there's clearly a
the
lot
fact
that
that
has
they've
gone
had a
wrong,
breach, the fact
and
they've
you'll
had a
have
breach shows that they
well,
weren't
you don't
meeting
have
requirements.
to,
Yeah.
but I'm just saying if that was the trigger for
Right.
whatever landed you in front of the OCR or the FTC, then it's going to be harder without the strong, high trust evidence, let's say, to prove that you were in fact doing what you should have been doing and
Mhm.
ended up with a breach anyways. Because the reality is we know nothing is airtight, right? You
Mhm.
can be buttoned up to the hilt, and it's really, really difficult to be completely airtight because you have humans involved in your organization and
No.
humans make mistakes. So it's hard to kind of erase that human element of mistake. However, if and this is what's going to be really interesting to watch the first few situations, I think, is to see where that line of proof comes. Because I haven't watched, a lot of the situations that I'm sure the FTC has done with financial organizations or things like that, where if they didn't have the hard evidence, is it, leaning towards they're innocent because there's not proof that they're guilty, or is it the other way around? They can't prove that they were doing the
Well,
compliance things,
you've got to
and
remember
so they are guilty.
you got to remember in a civil action, it has nothing to do with proof. It's a preponderance of proof. It's not actually,
Mm.
are you guilty or not? It's a preponderance of proof. And the main difference comes in a civil action. To get discovery, all you have to do is show cause. So, you know, there has been an incident. And what shows cause? Well, the fact that an organization, what's going to cause somebody to initially want to do or file an action against a healthcare provider? Well, first of all, you did something to piss me off. You know, um, what did you do? And so I went down and I had a lawyer file a lawsuit against you. And the first thing that we're going to do is request discovery. And as part of that discovery, we're going to do a review. And just because you can produce a high trust audit or a SOC 2 audit, ultimately it's going to come down that it's going to be what was the qualifications of that auditor to show that they actually had the ability and the knowledge and the experience to do that audit.
Mm.
And just because you pass that audit doesn't do anything, because if you look at the audit within itself, I mean, it's a good start point, but it doesn't show enough to remove uh, that minimal requirement of
But
saying, oh, we met the requirement.
wouldn't that be kind of in high trust favor then? Because high trust is requiring specific for readiness licensee or for a validated assessor, they're requiring
Mhm.
a certain level of experience and education. And then in
Mhm.
addition, they're reviewing that audit as well. So I would think that,
Right.
an organization would have an easier time proving that, hey, I did best effort to make sure that I had a qualified
Right.
person, as opposed to, I threw in a SOC auditor and maybe
Right.
that was the first one they'd ever done.
But
Yeah. And I
if you're
think
trying to,
there's also, this is where high trust interest and their engagement with different situations, whenever the OCR is involved, high trust gets right in there,
Mhm.
because, I think this is kudos to high trust, because they're interested in understanding if something went wrong, that they can improve or tighten up or, optimize on their end. They want to do that because they know at this point in time that people are relying on their brand, their controls that they have, the reputation they've built for being stringent and strict and strong as a security framework. And so they're all over that. If anybody gets pulled in or breached or there's a suspected situation, high trust gets quite involved. I haven't had one personally, but they get quite involved from what I've heard, so that they can really understand where the issue was. And I think we see those results in subsequent frameworks and feedback and that type of thing.
Okay, can I be a devil's advocate for a second?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, first of all, high trust isn't even a framework. So
Well, it's a
your
CSF,
argument,
so it's a security
no,
framework.
it says a common security framework, and it
Mhm.
within itself is not a framework. High trust is taking everybody else's frameworks and simply making them available. So
That's where they
that
started, but they've actually built
no,
quite
no,
a
they
bit
haven't.
beyond
They have not.
that.
They've not built a single acceptable framework. What they have built is they've taken the commonality in all the existing
Right.
frameworks and put it together as the base.
Right.
That within itself is not a framework.
But then they've pulled specific ones that are requiring for certification. So you can add additional, regulatory
Factors.
factors to it, but you're still at that point, they're saying, well, but here are the base ones that we're going to evaluate to see that you are considered a high trust certified organization.
Right.
So, I
Now,
mean,
the second part of that is when high trust is going to lose its credibility in front of a jury because they have large organizations who said, "Oh, we don't trust you to even put our data into your system. We have to use our own system and then take our data through that process." Um, High Trust has not even come out with a document that says that we've audited ourselves and we find ourselves to be compliant with a third party. Uh, and a lot of organizations that I've talked to don't actually trust High Trust storage process to actually harbor their data,
now
their
I
security
think the
data.
my CSF has been high trust certified. I'll double check that. I don't know
It
if
kind of that then becomes kind of the
I mean,
granddaddy
yeah,
issue.
but
How can you do your yourself?
right.
Uh,
But I
So
mean,
let me
let me
jump in and add a
go
couple
ahead.
thoughts here. So yeah,
Yeah.
there are definitely organizations that do not place their data within my CSF as part of their certification process.
Hmm.
I believe Azure, AWS, those are some of the bigger ones that do that. And any organization is not required to put their information into my CSF to be able to go through a validated assessment and be certified. They just have to go through live QA. So that mechanism exists, and the fact that organizations leverage it don't necessarily mean that organizations don't trust high trust. I can certainly see from an auditor standpoint why like the workflow might be preferred to just rely on live QA. So I mean that's just one thought there, and I agree though. High trust on its own is two things.
yeah.
First of all, they operate a security framework. They build the CSF, but then they're
Mhm.
also a certification body. Those are the two
Right.
main elements. And if you really get into it, HITRUST is also a software as a service provider. They have a number of different software products that organizations can leverage. So,
Yeah. So don't get me wrong, guys. I'm not trying to slam high trust. What I'm looking at this from a perspective of what happens when you go into a court.
well, I think one of the challenging parts
Everything would get tore apart at that
when we
point.
talk about whether it's HITRUST or SOC 2 or anything, it's important to remember that no audit really provides absolute assurance. And when we're talking about, was this organization compliant, it would be very difficult for any organization to prove that they were compliant as of a point in time in the past because nobody was sitting there at that moment auditing it. And it's very similar for even SOC 2, high trust. You know, neither of those mechanisms are intended to be able to uncover omissions or
Well,
misleading statements or just inadvertently false statements or evidence
and
from that standpoint.
I agree with you completely, Richard. But I think that there's actually one more part to add to that. The audit ends on a given date.
Hmm.
They can't tell what happens beyond that date.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
never know. I mean, the day that the report is given, the day after that,
There could be another vulnerability.
you're
Yeah.
back in the
Hmm.
wild.
Yeah, I
So
actually had a client that would say that they were like, zero vulnerabilibilities. And I'm like, whoa, no, don't say that
no,
because I
at
mean,
this
maybe
point
that
in time,
day,
Bad idea.
yeah, I was like, never tell anybody we have zero vulnerabilities,
yep.
even in a
It's
sales
tempting
thing. I'm
fate.
like, yeah, that too. But I was just like,
Yes.
you
And if
can't
you employ a human, you have a vulnerability
exactly.
all the
Well,
time,
the
every
fact
day,
that you are a
365 days a
human
year.
means that you have a vulnerability. You're
Exactly.
exactly right. So, ultimately what it's going to come down to, and kind of what I'm trying to get at here is there's healthcare is going to have to be more resilient and more focused on actually uh, trying to adhere to the requirements uh, than to simply say, well, it's okay if I accept the vulnerability or accept the exposure because the fine is less than the cost of actually meeting it. Uh, and they have to accept the fact that they can now be brought into, or they will at that time, be able to be brought into a legal action that's going to do two things and be brought there simply because of the perception, at least to start, the perception that they haven't met the requirement. And when I say that that is going to open up two things, well, one, that opens up a an issue for the organization being sued. But under the responsible corporate officer doctrine, it's also going to open up direct responsibility to the executives in that organization. Because yeah, I can sue, XYZ hospital or healthcare organization. I can also go after their CEO, their CFO, their COO, their CIO, CISO, their security admin, their IT admin, because
Well, no
all
wonder
these
all those
people
CISOs
should
are
have
leaving
known.
healthcare.
Yeah, that is exactly why the CISOs have left
Hmm.
healthcare.
They're
Yeah.
like, bye. But I mean,
Because
they're not
healthcare,
going to banks because you can still do the same thing at a bank in a
yeah, but
financial.
banks, actually though, banks have shown that they have a much greater uh, intent of actually meeting requirements, because at the end of the day, with the bank and the financial institution, it's not just about getting sued or getting fined. The uh, the government can actually come in, take over, put you into receivership, and give your customers away. And then you're just completely out of business, or you're losing your business, and the people that are responsible are now going to lose everything.
Yeah. And
So
they can do that
that
for governments as well. For
yeah,
like the county government, if they're finding that they're not being good,
good
stewards of
stewards.
everything, the state
Exactly.
can step in and similar. Do you think
Hmm.
that'll ever happen in a healthcare situation? The government would be like, hey, okay, we're gonna bring somebody else in to run your hospital for you.
I think it will if they're not meeting patient privacy. Now, it's going to take a while for it to get to that
Right.
point. And, but I can honestly see that if you are just actively disregarding, uh, the privacy requirements, and you're playing fast and loose just with the overall requirements, I can see it happen.
Yeah,
When it's going to
because
happen?
they can't run you out of business. I mean, you've got patients,
No, they
and
they
things like
they
that. So they would have
absolutely
to,
need you
right,
need. It's not like a bank where I can just pass them off to another bank and everybody's, happy and continues.
right,
ATMs, everybody's ATM works for everybody.
right. Yeah,
Hospitals,
you can't move the
if
patients
if I
around.
close if I close down one hospital, that is a massive impact.
Exactly.
But they can put the hospital under government control. You know,
Or issue a
all
fine that makes it necessary to sell various facilities, which means they would
that could be.
automatically then be under somebody else's control, you
That could
know?
be, but I'm more concerned about the smaller providers, and
Mm.
the smaller medical groups,
Hmm.
um, because I think they can be impacted significantly much faster and harder as a result of this.
Yeah,
Uh,
and that was interesting because that was one of the things that was brought up by the CISOs at this HIMSS forum today was that mergers and acquisitions for the most part when you're a hospital and you're looking
Mm.
at merging or acquiring somebody it's because they're in trouble financially and so security is one of the last things that they've been concentrating on for a while because
mhm.
they've really just been trying to get patient care and take care of that so if they're in financial straits you're typically not acquiring a gold star stellar
Mm.
organization when it comes to
Yep,
InfoSec.
Yeah. I
yep.
wonder though if this is actually going to slow down the mergers and acquisitions happening within the healthcare industry because maybe healthcare organizations are going to be a little more cautious about who they acquire so they understand the mess that they're potentially getting into because when they own it their CISO's on the line or whoever whatever the CISO is that they have overseeing that and then they're the ones who potentially could get dragged into court. So I think they'll be more mindful because it has been a fast game as far as that goes the last several years of mergers and acquisitions throughout healthcare. It's tricky to keep pace with even medical records. I've got a client who's a personal injury law firm, and they'll get partway through something, and they discover they've got to go to an entirely different name, address, billing department for all the records of the patient that finished treating a month or two ago.
Yep.
And
Everything changes.
it is an intense pace at which it's changing. So I wonder if that's actually going to slow things down because companies are going to start paying a bit more attention. I find
Actually,
frustratingly,
my
security is
guess,
often the last thing they look at in due diligence.
my I would be willing to put money on it actually going the other way.
Really?
The reason for that is I could see more smaller organizations just trying to sell off before it becomes a problem for them. And they will sell off at a cheaper rate
Mm.
just to alleviate themselves of the problem.
Well, the cheaper rate's going to be, it might have to be necessary if there are a lot of organizations in that situation because there won't be potentially as many buyers. It'll be a seller heavy situation if that's why and where people are going.
I mean, I can see that happening because it's going to be like, well, if I now have all these new regulations and I have this
Mm.
massive additional risk
Hmm.
that can come after me personally as the president or CEO of this group,
Yeah.
if I can sell it off to, Richards and Richards and let them take it over from here, um, I'll do it at 75 cents on the dollar.
What about dividing companies down? Because if I were a massive mega healthcare corporation, one of the first things that I might be looking at is how do I divide my organization up, in terms of different entities, possibly under, with a singular investor across the board. But how do I divide them up to protect each individual entity in case there is something big so
Well,
that it puts parameters around it. And I don't know if anybody else has kind
I
of
don't know,
thought
but
about that or seen it.
my
But
daughter works for a group uh, out of Franklin, and her company is what they do is they have fractional ownership in hundreds of different healthcare organizations. So they don't own it outright. They own a portion of it. So what's happened in what we're seeing is a lot more of this where you don't have a single owner. You have fractional ownership in these. So it makes it much harder to try to go after that top of the line. You'd have to keep it at, keep any action you have at a smaller level instead of trying to get up to a larger organization because you're never going to touch the true ownership because it's broken up amongst, 5, 10, 15 different groups. And then it's going to
oh,
be,
no.
well, how can I say that, you know, the ownership of this group was responsible when it's, every owner is going to say, well, I didn't own enough of it to make a difference.
Or
It
Donna,
gives
were
them
you talking
plausible
about
deniability.
ownership? Were you talking about function?
So I was actually talking about function and anticipating that there might be a further level of ownership to, so that the people who own the organization at the moment can maybe keep their fingers in all the pies. But in terms of a functional and structural entity, breaking it down, because if I had a healthcare organization that spanned, a dozen or 2 dozen hospitals across a couple of different states, Chicago area gets a lot of this because you got the state lines quite close. The metropolitan area spans beyond. You see the same thing in, kind of the Boston to DC corridor. There's a lot joined up in there that spans multiple state lines. I'd be looking quite quickly to see, maybe not quickly, but I'd be looking with vested interest to understand, what the beneficial limits are of how I might break down and go, oh, okay, well, I'm going to create a state entity because I can justify why that makes sense. And then it also means anything that happens within that state, at one of those hospitals can't touch a hospital, say at a neighboring state, even though it's kind of part of the same organization.
Mhm.
I mean, Humana jumps to mind, or,
Oh,
and I don't know exactly what their structure is, but an organization like that, there are a number of those kind of mega organizations that do own multiple hospitals from a functional perspective. But I
I
just,
would,
this sound from, and that's me talking about from a risk perspective, which is how do you limit your risk? How do you mitigate that situation of, um, you know, having your whole organization exposed in a single court case?
right. Well,
Well,
it's not really a matter when you look at it from that perspective, you know, that's fine. But ultimately, when you are the CEO of the, XYZ Healthcare and you own 15 different hospitals and 15 different, you know, groups that you've broken that down into at the same, if one of those is brought into action, that's still going to come to you. But if you have, as XYZ healthcare organization, you have then ownership of you is amongst 10, 15 different other private equity organizations or investment organizations or whatever, holding companies, whatever it may be. Now what you can say is, well, yeah, but I'm really not the one that makes, I'm responsible for the operational stuff, but I still have a responsibility to these guys. So I'm not the one who really makes the final decision. So that's up to the boards of these other groups. So it just makes it harder. There's only so far and leads opens or basically closes some of those loopholes that are going to open you up individually.
But I think just overall, that's going to be harder to be able to manage anything related to that if you've got to have a committee of people making those decisions as far as, where are we headed, and that type of thing. So yeah, I can, it
It
may
can
get
create
around
a
a lawsuit, but it's basically you're creating a Congress to run your business.
yeah, but I mean this is what's already happening today.
Yeah, I think it's, there are companies that already do this. There are other industries that already do this. And I could absolutely see the healthcare industry starting to break down. I've seen situations already where, a mega healthcare org has acquired a collection and then actually kind of backed out of it, or collaborations between two mega organizations who then each backed out. Um, and I might be explaining it wrong from an ownership perspective, but I think we will see, more CEO of the in-state hospitals or this smaller collection of hospitals
Mhm.
rather than CEO of an organization that covers 100,
Right. You
because it
see,
is fundamentally too much exposure, for the investors wouldn't, they're going to be looking at this going, you're going to put 150 hospitals at risk versus breaking it down, Congress or otherwise, versus breaking it down and ensuring that 150 hospitals can't get dragged into a single court case.
right.
That's a
And you'll
huge amount of
see
risk for any organization.
if you get out on LinkedIn, you'll see people that are regional CEOs,
Mm-hmm,
individual organizational CEOs.
mm-hmm,
As part of, yeah, I'm the CEO of this hospital, which is part of
mm-hmm.
this group. Um, yeah, so you're going to see a lot of that, and that segmentation of where the responsibility really comes out to, and you have to be able to keep these guys separated, and they have to understand. And believe me, I think that you've got it used to be that your healthcare organization leadership were doctors, and today they're not. You know, most of them have never seen the inside of a medical school, uh, so they understand business really well, uh, and that's the position that they take. Is we it patient responsibility is second to the organizational responsibility, uh, and that's what is caused a problem within our healthcare industry.
All right. Well, let's solve world hunger next week, but I'm taking on the big task today. I had
Sam
one
Kennison
other.
did that for us.
Oh, good. Told no one though.
No, oh, no, he
Uh,
made it very clear. He says, don't take people food in the desert.
in the desert, right?
Send them suitcases. Tell them move to the cities. There's food there.
One other question that I had, I saw that HITRUST created an advisory. Let me share my screen. Um, Sent out an advisory, I think it was this week or last week, April 14th, so a couple weeks ago, about HITRUST CSF 11.5 coming out. Oh, I'm not sharing, am I? Okay. HITRUST 11.5 coming out. And the fact that, it had all these different, new things for an R2, which, obviously their focus is for R2. And then it's
Mhm.
like, hey, nothing's happened with, actually nothing for the baseline assessments, and there's no impact to E1 and I1. But they kind of said, hey, if you already have an E1 or an I1 that's 11.4, you can keep it. At some point in the future, we'll tell you you can no longer submit it. but I kind of wanted to just get people's thoughts on, okay, if you were in the middle of an E1 or an I1, you haven't submitted it yet, maybe you're 6 weeks or 8 weeks away from submitting it. What are your thoughts on just going to 11.5, or would you just kind of stay the course on 11.4, knowing there's no changes either way?
Yeah, that kind of happened to us. We were on 11.2 and then 11.3.2 came out and there were two changes in our favor. So like we just went ahead and upgraded because we didn't actually have to do anything differently. So
Okay.
if there's no changes, just
Just
run it
keep
through,
going.
man.
Yeah, I agree. I would just move it forward. That way you don't have an issue with it later of having to make a move where you didn't when you didn't want to.
Yeah, because I was just thinking it was probably best to move forward just so that you didn't have to have that conversation with everybody for a whole year going, well, why were you on 11.4? And just go, well, there were no differences, and this way you're like, hey, we're on the latest when we submitted it. It's probably more so on an R2 perspective because there's more at
Yes.
stake with R2. But yeah, I was just wondering, people's thoughts on, you're 2 weeks out from submitting. Probably keep
Oh,
it
I
the
would
way
never
it
change
was.
in the middle of an
Yeah.
assessment.
Yeah.
That would I would never change in the middle of an assessment.
Okay. So once you've started loading evidence, you're like,
yes,
keep it.
the framework
Okay.
is established. The framework version is established before the assessment period starts. I think it has to be because otherwise
It is.
the assessors wouldn't know which one to be using.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
no,
part
you
of the
create it. Yeah.
initial. It's part of the initial sign-off process for the assessor. If there's no
Yeah.
major changes, there's no reason not to upgrade. But I would agree that once you've started the assessment, that's not the time to really do that. I think some people read this and they think, oh, am I going to get stuck into submitting in a time when I don't have to? Well, HITRUST has a track record of giving plenty of notice.
Yeah,
Mhm.
they
Even
do.
when they transitioned to version 11, they gave tons of time for organizations to transition away from 9 dot. For example, the 9 dot sunset date was just yesterday. We submitted our final 9 dot assessment to a
Wow.
client yesterday because their timeline had basically been like, well, we're due in May, but we'll just stick on 9 and turn it in on April 30th, and we'll just eat a couple weeks of certification. But yeah, I mean, normally it's not unusual for them to make these small changes, and even when they have made these changes throughout the version 11 lifecycle, the changes have been pretty minimal. For example, they've made changes to the immutable backups requirement a couple times. When it first came out, it talked about systems and data, and then they took the systems part out, so now it's just data. So typically these minor versions have very little impact on, the requirements and whether or not somebody's going to be certified on a particular version. So what we do is, as long as there's no negative impacts towards any gap assessment work we did with the client, if there's a new version available before we start the assessment, we go ahead and have them upgrade before we start.
Okay.
Cool.
Jeff,
Before,
you look like you keep wanting to say
oh,
something.
I do, and I'm often on mute. My wife puts me on mute. But
I bet my husband wishes he had a mute button for me.
Exactly. Actually, Richard
Why
was
would he
saying
want
something,
that?
and I need to jump here in a minute. But you actually touched on immutable backups, and on one of these weeks, I would love to hear Richard's or someone else's opinion on that subject.
Yeah, I've actually written a LinkedIn article that I haven't published yet. It's called
Ooh,
Immutability is Nothing. And it talks
hot
about
off
the
the
fact
presses.
that the idea that immutability in a largely digital world is very misunderstood. And mutability relates especially to how it's implemented from a high trust standpoint is really just a marketing gimmick because anything that's a 1 or a 0 is not really immutable. And we kind of have gotten ahead of ourselves talking about things being immutable, which are like, oh, that's not really immutable, when instead we should just go back to the old school methods of defense in depth. I'm not saying that everybody has to do backup tapes, but there's a lot of things to consider as to whether or not your backups are immutable that have nothing to do with whether or not you've checked a box in AWS backup to turn on compliance mode in Vault. And there's a lot of different ways
Wait.
to implement that.
Don't spill your candy in the lobby is the saying. I would love to hear that presentation, if it fits with the rest of the group
Yeah.
and what we're doing here.
Yeah. If you want to release the article or what, your write
And then
up on
come talk about it.
LinkedIn and talk about, like, you can also say showcasing on the HITRUST
On the May
Secrets.
8th.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
probably need to polish it a little bit more.
That's warm up with
it's
us. Warm up with us. Come on, we're an easy
yeah,
group.
it's
Warm up with
well,
us.
it's a
Get our
pretty brutal
feedback.
article. It's pretty much
Okay.
saying the way that many bodies are looking at immutability and are expecting immutability is flawed, because you're saying, oh, you need to be using this solution with this checkbox, and that makes it immutable. And you're like, well,
Well, I mean, first of all,
there's
anybody
so many
who
ways that can be flawed.
All right.
anybody
I
who
don't want to
thinks
get into
that
this conversation. I really don't.
But
I
sure,
have to
Jeff.
schedule
go.
it.
I agree with Richard.
But
Next
I
week.
want to talk about it later. So it's great to see everybody.
That's awesome.
Good to
All
see
right.
you too.
I agree with
Yeah.
Richard 100%. It's not, you cannot protect everything, but it has a great deal to do with what you are putting in there is also a major factor in that.
I'll tell you what,
Perfect.
maybe Susan and Donna, maybe I'll send a draft copy over to you and you can take a look at it and tell me what you think.
Yeah.
And I'd be happy to release
Yes.
it and then talk about it, because I think it would be a great topic of conversation
Yeah.
and get into. Because it's not just bashing the requirement within HITRUST, but it's also like, hey, let's step back and be realistic about what are we really trying to address.
What's the
with this
intent? Yeah.
requirement.
The intent is
Yeah.
that I'm not backing up ransomware that is, I'm just, oops, I still have ransomware
But
type of thing.
let's save
But
the rest of it for Jeff.
Perfect.
That
Excellent.
sounds good. That sounds great.
All right.
Good.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Bye.
Well, thanks
All right.
everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thanks everybody for
Okay, see ya.
joining today.
Bye.
Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real-world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.